All right, so thank you to everybody involved with this conference. Thank you to Karen and all the Rafiki faculty and staff who have been so hospitable. For me, especially thank you to Mehdi Marithi, who has taken such good care of me the last couple days. Also, thank you to Suleiman and the faculty of St. Paul's University, the wonderful people of Kenya, and all the other countries represented here. We are so encouraged to be with you, and we see ourselves as your colleagues is in this good work to which God has called us. Now, this is the work that Christian educators have been about since the beginning of the Christian tradition, whether in Africa, Europe, North America, Asia, whether in the 4th century, 12th, 16th, or 21st century. If you've been in my workshop, you know it's the work of fostering the integrated and holistic formation of persons intellectually by nurturing them on the true, morally on the good, aesthetically on the beautiful, spiritually on the holy, physically orienting them to the healthy, practically by training them for beneficial work, and socially by forming them to love their neighbors well. By attending to this work, the church works not only for the holistic flourishing of individual human persons, but through them, for the holistic flourishing of the families, neighborhoods, businesses, and cultures they will go on to create. Now, given that, I probably don't need to persuade a group of Christian educators why the church has, always has, and should attend and should be involved in this kind of work. I mean, if nothing else, the church always has been involved in this kind of work. Everywhere it's gone, it's built 3 buildings. What are the 3 buildings the church has built everywhere it's gone in the world? Okay. Churches to care for our souls, hospitals to care for our bodies, and schools to nurture hearts and minds. So when the church extends its work through churches and schools and hospitals, it's not acting outside its mission. It's fulfilling its mission to care for whole persons and serve the common good of every land. Now, for a time, I was ignorant of this great educational tradition in the church. As was mentioned in the introduction, I was trained as a systematic and historical theologian, but after I began teaching at Care Paravel Latin School in Kansas, I was delighted to discover that many of the people I knew as theologians had also been, or maybe I should say had really been, teachers, headmasters, homeschoolers, academic administrators, wardens of boarding schools, and teachers of teachers. They were educators who fought curricular battles with political authorities, navigated tricky internal tensions with colleagues, prepared lesson plans for children and teenagers, struggled to find time to read and write on their own, and generally lived lives remarkably similar to our own. Now, this includes men like Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Augustine of Hippo, all here on the African continent. Gregory of Nazianzus in Basel in Asia Minor, Boethius in Rome, the homeschooling mother Duoda, who wrote a Augustinian handbook of spiritual formation for her son. It includes the German playwriting nun Hratzvita, who wrote the first Christian plays in Europe based on the Carthaginian Terence. It includes Hugh of St. Victor, Thomas Aquinas, Christine de Pizan in Paris, Alcuin, John Wycliffe, and John Henry Newman in England, Philip Melanchthon and Martin Luther in Wittenberg, John Calvin in Geneva, Comenius in Poland, Teresa of Avila, the Anglican John Colet, John Wesley, John Henry Newman, C.S. Lewis in Oxford. You get the idea. I could go on with this company of fellow classical Christian educators. Now, it doesn't matter if you're hearing some of these names for the first time. What matters is that we understand that as the church expanded through space and time, it always included a deep and abiding concern for education, and in most cases, for classical Christian education. Now, of course, to this list could be added the names, or could be added thousands more whose names are actually unknown. Because like us, They poured their time and their energy and their lives into students and schools and not writing books and scrolls. But we are the beneficiaries of these nameless teachers who received the tradition from people before them, nurtured it and developed it, and passed it on to their students, who passed it on to their students, and finally passed it on to us. For our students, who we hope will pass it on into the future to cultures and children yet unborn. Now, I want to emphasize that these people I've mentioned really were practitioners and not just theorists. So here in the 16th century, Philip Melanchthon, the great Reformation theologian alongside Martin Luther, he writes a speech entitled On the Misery of Teachers. And he passed a statute at his university to curb, quote, students who disrupt study, disobey the rector, gamble, party in the night, break into houses, instigate fights, visit prostitutes, and indulge in whatever the 16th century version of immodest dancing was. The 12th century Hugh of St. Victor references students at rest in their own sluggishness, who wrinkle their noses and purse their lips at lectures, who break out in angry condemnation of anything they don't understand, and who think that nothing is good but what they think they know. And we realize that Hugh knows teachers when he counsels them and us not to overwhelm their students with unrelated theories or ideas that confuse students more than edify them. Instead, he says teachers should not say everything we are able to say, lest we say less profitably the things that we ought to say, and because this is not the teaching of others, but the showing off of our own knowledge. Now, I'm probably not the only teacher who recognizes both his students and himself in this depiction that Hugh gives us, which is somewhat comforting. It's also comforting and encouraging to read a letter like the one from the famous Renaissance scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, who wrote his discouraged teacher friend John Witz. Erasmus writes this: "To be a schoolmaster is next to being a king. Do you count it lowly employment to imbue the minds of the young with the things of Christ and the best of literature and return them to their homes honest and virtuous persons? In the opinion of fools, it's a humble task, but in fact, it is the noblest of occupations. No one does more for one's country than the man who shapes its unformed young people, provided he himself is learned and honorable." 400 years after Erasmus, another Christian classical educator, John Henry Newman, echoes the significance of teachers in the lives of students, schools, and cultures. Newman writes this: "The general principles of any study you may learn by books at home, but the detail, the color, the tone, the air, the life which makes it lives in us, you must catch all those from those in whom it lives already. We must come to the teachers of wisdom to learn wisdom. We must repair to the fountain, ad fontes, and drink there. Portions of it may go from thence to the ends of the earth by means of books, but the fullness is in one place alone, and that's the teacher." Let me draw your attention to one phrase in Newman's paragraph here. That's the phrase made famous in the Renaissance, "to the fountain," or ad fontes. Now, repairing to the fountain often means returning to important books and authors as the source of knowledge and wisdom. We have schools and publications named ad fontes, and some of us dedicate our lives to becoming students of this great tradition that flowed like a river after it bubbled up from the minds of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and others. But that's not how Newman is using the phrase here. He's not referring to Plato, Aristotle, Sappho, or Seneca, Aquinas, or Calvin, but to contemporary teachers as the sources from which students will draw wisdom. Now, you might be feeling like Dante in the opening of the comedy after Virgil tells him of this great journey and task they're going to undertake. And he says, "I am not Aeneas. I am not Paul. I can't do that." Or Christine de Pizan in her riff on Dante's comedy called The Way of Long Study, where she says, "I am hardly Nebuchadnezzar, Scipio, or Joseph. I can't do that." And we might be saying, I'm not even Hugh, Christine Newman, or David Diener. I can't do that. And that's all right, I'm not either. And even though Hugh and Christine and Newman and David Diener might have things to offer your students that you can't, you have things to offer your students they can't, which is a living embodiment in their midst of an ordinary human person living the classical Christian tradition. Because of that, local classical Christian teachers are the deep wells that nourish local, culturally and intellectually parched students in a desert wasteland of social media, state education, and shallow culture. How? Because classical Christian education is not simply about passing on skills and knowledge from the classical tradition, but about passing on a classical Christian way of living. The classical Christian vision of a fully alive and integrated life. And that requires that students see living models of the classical Christian tradition. Living models of wonder, learning, love, wisdom, and worship in their time and place. So only by offering ourselves as models of classical Christian living in our contemporary secular times will students, their families, and our cultures catch the detail, color, tone, air, and life that breathes in and through the classical Christian tradition. This same thing is what drew at least one student, Lawrence of Westminster, to leave his home in England to go to Paris to study with this guy, Hugh of St. Victor. He wrote his family, "With all possible dispatch, I chose this excellent and unique teacher, and I embrace his teaching with supreme diligence, since the moral excellence of his life decorates his learning, and the saintliness of this teacher illuminates his polished teaching with beauty of manners." This is why when Christine de Pizan reflects on the kind of people we need as classically educators, she writes, "One ought to provide a tutor who is wise and prudent more in morals than in lofty learning. Yet it would be much more praiseworthy to find a perfect one who is a notable scholar as well." This is because the tradition affirms a master and apprentice model of education. The Greeks called this mimesis, learning by imitation. This is Christ saying a disciple will be like his master. This is Paul telling Timothy, "Follow me as I follow Christ." This is incarnate pedagogy, or in a wonderful phrase from Newman, a rhetoric of conduct. It means classical teachers need to be the kind of people we want our students to become. Let me say that again. Classical teachers need to be the kind of students, the kind of people we want our students to become. It means as classical teachers, we offer our own lives as part of the curriculum, and we offer students water from our own wells, which have been dug deep into the groundwaters of the tradition through reading and prayer, study and worship, wonder and devotion, so that the waters of the classical Christian tradition pour into us so they might bubble up and overflow into the lives of our students. Now, not only was I delighted when I started doing some of this work to discover that many of the theologians I studied were really teachers, I was also delighted to discover that Hugh and Erasmus and Melanchthon, like so many others, taught both Christianity and the classics, theology and the liberal arts, the gospel and Greek tragedy, piety and philosophy, Seneca and scripture. This is because very early in its history, the church, especially Africans like Origen, Augustine, Cyprian, Clement, and Athanasius, received and transformed the philosophy, history, literature, and science of the two Mediterranean cultures at the heart of the classical tradition, Greece and Rome. The church did this because it found in these two Mediterranean cultures tools and insights that could help develop humanity's natural capacity to know the true, do the good, make the beautiful, and worship the holy. And so Christian educators brought these two pagan Mediterranean traditions into dialogue with the Jewish and Christian traditions in order to relocate them, or maybe properly locate them for the first time within salvation history. Now, our church fathers and mothers were encouraged to do this by that Middle Eastern Jew, St. Paul, who wrote this: encouraging his readers and us to think continuously about whatever is true, noble, right, pure, worthy of love, admirable, virtuous, and praiseworthy, apparently regardless of where we find these things or which of God's creatures first discovered them or best articulated them. He follows this up, interestingly, in Philippians 4:9 with, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me, including the statement he just made to think about these noble things, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Thinking and practicing whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, virtuous, and praiseworthy is not a bad summary of classical Christian education and classical Christian living. Now, in order to describe this activity of commandeering non-Christian wisdom and reframing it within the revealed gospel, St. Augustine, as Dr. Diener told us yesterday, invokes that moment in Israel's history when God provoked the Egyptians to give the Israelites silver and gold with which they later created the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. And so St. Augustine writes this, referring to this as plundering of the Egyptians. He says, if those non-Christian writers have said things which are indeed true and well accommodated to our faith, let me repeat that. If they've said things which are true and well accommodated, they should not be feared. Rather, what they have said should be taken from them as from unjust possessors and converted to our use. Because the teachings of the pagans contain liberal disciplines suited to the uses of truth and some of the most useful precepts concerning morals. Other Christian educators like Clement of Alexandria in modern Egypt and Rabanus Maurus, they skip the metaphor of plundering the Egyptians altogether if that means stealing, because they point out that non-Christian thinkers have no proprietary claim over that which is true, good, beautiful, or holy. Instead, whatever is true, good, beautiful, and holy properly belongs to God, who shares it with all of his children. So the task of the Christian educator is to wisely discern between the wheat and the chaff that secular writers, scientists, and artists offer us, and to learn from the centuries of prudent sifting and sorting that have gone on before us. Now, Basil of Caesarea, he compares this Christian practice of sifting and sorting to bees extracting nectar from thorny flowers. Listen to him. He says, bees do not approach all flowers equally, nor in truth do they attempt to carry off the entire flower. That would be like accepting Plato's and Aristotle's entire way of thinking. Instead, discriminating bees take only so much from the flower as is suitable for their work, and they leave the rest untouched. So a theologian like me can learn from Aristotle's teaching on virtue, but reject his teaching about an impersonal God. So Basil says the wise student or scholar will appropriate from this literature what is suitable to us and akin to the truth and pass over the rest. And just as in plucking the blooms from a flower, from a rosebud, we avoid the thorns, so also in gathering what is useful from these writings, let us guard against what is harmful. What he has in mind is exactly what I saw all the tea pickers do on Monday when we drove through the tea growing region of the country here. Tea pickers don't pick every single tea leaf. They select only those which will contribute to a nourishing cup of tea, and the others they let wither on the tree or wither on the ground. That's what Basil and Clement and others have in mind. 900 years after Basil, the remarkable 12th century woman Herod of Langsburg, abbess of the Hohenberg Abbey, and the author of the pictorial encyclopedia, The Garden of Delights, picks up this metaphor of bee and honey. And she writes in the introduction, like a little bee inspired by God, I collected from the various flowers of sacred scripture and philosophic writings this book, which is called The Garden of Delight. And I brought it together to the praise and honor of Christ and the church, and for the sake of your love, as if into a single sweet honeycomb. Therefore, in this very book, you ought diligently to seek pleasing food and to refresh your exhausted soul with its honeyed dewdrops. And Herod of Langsburg, this abbess, she creates this amazing image that we often show in our schools about how the 7 liberal arts and the philosophers Plato and Aristotle nurture the love of wisdom. Philosophy shown in the middle as this woman. And for her, that philosophy is the Philosophia Christi, the philosophy of Christ. And this very famous image is her attempt to show how all of the arts that we learn from whatever source contribute to our devotion to and love of wisdom. Now, this image of the flowers and bees and honey, I think, is also a really good way to understand perhaps how Moses benefited from studying under the Egyptians. How Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego benefited from learning from the Babylonians, and Paul and Apollos from learning from the Greeks. Now, Daniel 1, where we get the beginning of the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is, to my mind, the only chapter in the Bible that reflects on higher education. In it, what do we see happen? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, though they are famous for 2 things, they're famous for rejecting the king's meat and wine, and they're famous for refusing to bow down to the idol and getting chucked in the furnace, right? But if you look at Daniel 1, you know what they didn't reject? They didn't reject 3 years of studying Babylonian language, literature, and science, because they didn't think that that would intrinsically corrupt them in the way that the king's meat and wine would. They found ways, if you will, like Basil's bees, to avoid Babylonian thorns in order to turn Babylonian nectar into Hebrew honey. This image, this painting, is from an artist that I commissioned a couple years ago, and this painting is Daniel 1. Now, you'll notice in it 4 figures, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you look closely at it, you might see that Daniel's coat is made of camel hair, and Abednego's tie has camels on it. And you'll see some other references to Daniel 1, including the vegetables at the bottom. But here, I asked the artist, and we worked on this image, to bring together multiple layers. There's the 4 men studying Babylonian language, literature, and science. But do you see what they're doing? One's down there with a book, reading and writing, pursuing perhaps grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Another one pursuing in the middle, music. Guy in the upper right, arithmetic and geometry, with his hand on the globe, because geometry means the measure of the earth. And then the 4th one outside, studying the stars and exercising the art of astronomy. So here I have layered together Daniel 1, the 7 liberal arts. And if you'll notice up at the top, what do you see around the border? See rose and cucumber vines with little bees drawing nectar from the honey. And from the top here, you can see words both from Basil and from Proverbs. And you'll see this line from Proverbs at the very top of the painting that says, or from Basil, as bees know how to extract honey from flowers. And then from Proverbs in the Bible, eat honey, my son, for it is good, and wisdom is like honey for your soul. The 16th century thinker Melanchthon and educator Melanchthon takes this idea even further, and he suggests that we should regard the insights of Greece and Rome as gifts directly given by God. He argues that there are many things not revealed through Jesus or in Scripture, like how to cultivate virtue or practically how to run a government, because in Melanchthon's word, this great Reformation theologian said God had already revealed them through Aristotle and Cicero. Now, he's not claiming that Aristotle and Cicero have the same level of authority as Christian Scripture, but that we should regard the wisdom and truth that they offer us as gifts God just happened to give through some secular thinkers. And Melanchthon, the first systematic theologian of the Reformation, also wrote commentaries on Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles, Euripides, Ovid, and Homer. Now, none of those have been translated into English, so they haven't had the impact they might have had. They rest in their Latin versions right now. My hope is that people translate these so we get to see what a Reformation theologian does with some of these great classical texts. But his decision to immerse himself in the classics and enfold them within Christianity isn't really unique. Consider again Augustine from modern Algeria, who planned to write books on all 7 of the liberal arts. He only published 1. You know why? He says, I lost the rest of them, and some of them I loaned out to my students and never got back. I mean, if that's not the experience of nearly every teacher, I don't know what is. Aquinas wrote commentaries on Aristotle. John Calvin's first book was a book on Seneca's political philosophy. My own teacher and mentor, J.I. Packer, his first degree was in classics at the University of Oxford. Think of the great black classicists you might know: W.B. Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper, William Sanders Scarborough, all great black classical educators from the 19th century, all of whom led classical schools and taught Greek, Latin, and literature. The American pastor Martin Luther King Jr., who studied the classics, who said that if he were stranded on a desert island, you know what 2 books he wants to take with him? The Bible and Plato's Republic. Because he said, everything you need to know and everything I want to think about is in those 2 books. Now, this long and rich tradition might not have happened. In its earliest days, the church was not settled on how to handle non-Christian literature and non-Christian art from the Mediterranean cultures. But it was a debate on African soil that first provided the foundation for the long tradition of classical Christian education. I'll say this again. Classical Christian education was a gift given to the church primarily by African Christians and secondarily by Christians of Asia Minor. This continent was its cradle and crib, and through the work of Rafiki and others, it seems like this long-lost prodigal's child who went into the far country is finally coming home. And though Tertullian of Carthage in modern Tunisia was skeptical about accepting secular insights and discoveries, Clement of Alexandria in Egypt was confident it could be done. In fact, Melanchthon's bold claim earlier was Clement's first. This 3rd century African writes this: before the Lord's coming, philosophy was an essential guide to the righteousness for the Greeks. Your foot will not stumble if you attribute good things, whether Greek or Christian, to providence. That's a powerful claim. We might add whether Asian or African good things, or French and Italian good things, or maybe even at a stretch and in small doses, American good things. He says God is responsible for all good things, of some like the blessings of the Old and New Covenants directly, of others like the blessings, the riches of philosophy indirectly. And this great African church father proceeds to commend the intellectual training that studying philosophy offers students, especially Christian ones, called to think and communicate to their cultures. He writes, truth is one. Everything is illuminated when the true light arises, so that all who stretched out towards the truth, Greeks and non-Greeks alike, could be shown to possess some portion of the word of truth. Some a considerable part, others a fraction as it falls out. But truth brings together its own seeds, even if they have fallen into alien soil. Now, that doesn't mean we allow secular artists, authors, and scholars to overstep their boundaries and instruct us about God and salvation history, but it does mean that the classical Christian tradition is a capacious tradition that is theologically driven to be open, not closed, to new discoveries or insights, new books and thinkers, especially when those books and thinkers and authors help us begin to ask the enduring questions that resonate in the soul of every human person and begin to grope for answers. What is truth? Why do we suffer? Who's my neighbor? What's my duty to my country? What's justice? Where do we come from? What am I here for? Where am I going? Is there a God? When the classical Christian tradition finds authors who speak to these enduring questions in deep and beautiful ways with wisdom and eloquence, it is theologically motivated to invite them to the table for conversation. And it was Clement from Egypt, Cyprian from modern Tunisia, and Augustine from modern Algeria who first forged this path. And I am grateful that most Christian educators in the long history of the church, including me, can trace our intellectual lineage back to these men from Africa. So as I've been saying and could say at length, classical Christian education is simply something the church has always done since its earliest days on this continent. The second, I'll be very brief here. The church has always done this because it aligns so closely with the church's mission to preserve, promote, and protect holistic human flourishing of individuals and their cultures across the 7 areas I've been unpacking in my workshop: intellectually, morally, aesthetically, spiritually, practically, physically, and socially. The love we are called to demonstrate to our neighbors is not limited to one of those dimensions. Yes, our neighbors have bodies that need to be cared for. They're physical creatures who suffer and are designed to work. They're also moral agents who act and need guidance on how to do that well. Intellectual creatures who think, artistic creatures who make, affective creatures who love and feel, and spiritual creatures created for community with God. And social creatures called to contribute to the common good of their cultures. So classical Christian education is one great but ordinary way to love our neighbors because it takes seriously the holistic formation of the human person. Third, even briefer, the church has practiced classical Christian education because our culture needs it. So we've heard many times over the past couple of days from Grant Horner, David Goodwin, Ken Mbugua, and others. And as we know in our bones, because we see it every day in our children and the society of Kenya, where we hear them crying for it in wordless despair, confusion, alienation, and desperation. So the church does it. It's what the church has always done. It aligns with our mission, and our cultures need classical Christian education. And it is fascinating and exciting to see how this tradition has nurtured, sustained, and consistently practiced an open and great conversation spread across space and time. Once again, that conversation is now including educators and theologians on the African continent. And yes, while I quote Augustine and Melanchthon, because they're my colleagues in this work, I also quote David Diener and Robin Burlew, and sometimes Grant Horner, even though he steals my jokes. But don't tell him I quote him because it'll just go to his head, because they're my companions in this work. Soon I expect that I will be quoting Kevin Ndereba from St. Paul's University and in Ken Mbugua, and if he's here, my brother, that was a great message you gave us earlier. And Shakila Solomon from Nigeria, and Melissa Waku, and others that I haven't met yet. Why? Because that's just being part of this great conversation across space and time in which we and our students participate. Now, let me illustrate this great conversation about the true, good, beautiful, and holy by taking you into the heart of one of the Christian church's most important churches. The conversation about true, good, and beautiful and holy that is at the heart of the church's education is reflected in the very heart of one of our greatest and most important churches historically. That is, in the Vatican in Rome. There's a room in the Vatican called the Stanza della Signatura, in which we find 4 fresco paintings from the 15th century on 4 facing walls, silently dialoguing with one another, with a profound wordless that witnesses to the work we're doing. This is the one you might expect to find in a church. It's called the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament. If you look at the bottom layer, you'll see theologians and poets and churchmen from across time drawn into one animated scene about the subject matter in the center of them all, which is a consecrated Eucharist or communion or Lord's Supper, the host right there. And the debate is about the incarnation, the substance of Christ in his incarnate state, and transubstantiation. Does it happen? Who was Christ in his incarnate state? And we see down below there on your right side, St. Augustine from North Africa. And I love St. Augustine here. He's got books falling off the steps, books on his lap. And if you look closely, he's got his finger stuck in a book for something he wants to say later. We also see Boethius and Aquinas and Dante, along with Ambrose, Gregory the Great, Bonaventure, and others. But above them, who do we see? Yes, we see God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit kind of overseeing the whole conversation. But around them, we see the prophets and apostles also deeply immersed in what? conversation with one another. Now, they might know a little bit more about the incarnation of Christ than the folks on the bottom, but they're still participating in this great conversation about the holy. Now, on the next wall, we see this. It's called Parnassus. And in the center of this scene is not Christ, the incarnate host, but Apollo, surrounded by the 9 muses, and beyond them, small knots of discoursing poets from antiquity to the Renaissance. Here, we see the blind poet Homer, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Behind him, Virgil and Dante are kind of having a secret conversation, I guess. Homer was blind, so he couldn't see him, but he could hear, so I'm not sure that's very successful. But you see Virgil and Dante talking with one another. Below them, Sappho, Ovid, and Horace. And across from them, Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Ariosto, all locked in lively exchange about poetry, the arts, and beauty. Now, there's another image here in this same room, one you might have seen before. One you might have seen rather frequently. This is called the School of Athens that Grant took us through yesterday so carefully and wonderfully. In the middle of this one, we see Plato cradle his work Timaeus and Aristotle carry his ethics, and they contend with one another about the truths of philosophy. But note what's in the very middle of this painting. It's not the incarnate Christ, and it's not Apollo. It's not even Plato and Aristotle. It's the space between Plato and Aristotle's faces. And what's filling that space? Words. A conversation. A great conversation about that which is true. And Plato says, no, the ideas above are really true. And Aristotle says, no, it's really the material world we have to start with. That's what's the most true. And around them, we see again little knots of philosophers. Zoroaster and Ptolemy and Protagoras, Averroes, Pythagoras, and Parmenides. And they're talking about the liberal arts, about arithmetic and music, about geometry, about justice, and about truth. And you'll notice several of them are looking over each other's shoulders, copying from one another. We don't allow our students to do that, but I guess it's fine in the School of Athens. Learning from one another, because very few of these guys lived at the same time and in the same place. This is, again, the great conversation about, here, the true. We've seen the great conversation about the holy, about the beautiful, about the true. And what's next? The good. Here, it's not a great conversation because this is rather settled. Here, what we see are the 7 virtues, the 3 theological virtues and the 4 cardinal basic virtues. The 4 virtues, justice, courage, temperance, and prudence, and the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. On your far left, you see courage holding an oak branch, the stability of courage, and a lion who exercises courage. But courage here has a little angel who represents charity, and together models courageous love. We see prudence with 2 faces. One looks into a mirror, so she achieves self-knowledge. The other, if you can see it, it's an old man's face looking back to the wisdom of the past, so she knows how to move into the future. And you know what theological virtue is with her? Hope. Because that's what you need to move into the future when the future doesn't look very hopeful. So prudence with hope gives us hopeful prudence for the future. Temperance on the right side holds reins that rein in our desires, accompanied by faith, which directs temperance and points to God in the sky above. So the faithful servant exercises self-control and faithful temperance. And above them all on the ceiling is justice with the scales, and justice is always paired with righteousness. So in this church, at the heart of one of the most important churches in the Christian tradition, what we see depicted here is an ongoing conversation across space and time about the true, good, beautiful, and holy. Here's a question, though. Why isn't John Calvin or Karl Barth or Bishop Tutu in the painting of the theologians? Why isn't John Milton or Jane Austen or Chinua Achebe painted among the poets, or Copernicus or Kepler or Ravi Jain among the philosophers, simply because they hadn't been born yet. But now that they have, now that they've written, now that they've taught, they've joined the great conversation. And were this painting to be painted again, we'd find space for all of those people. Once the tradition discovered them, they invited them to the table. Once the tradition discovers authors who maybe wrote 1,000 years ago, but we didn't know about, once we discover those authors, we again invite them to the table. Because we are theologically driven as Christian classical educators to find and appreciate and embrace truth, goodness, and beauty wherever we find it. Now, one final thing to note before I bring us home is that these four walls are connected in one room. They are not separate discourses, but one discourse about four essential areas of human well-being. Like Dr. Horner, I like to imagine the debates between these walls after they turn off the lights and lock the door. Now, no doubt at all that the seven virtues have to step in and sometimes play the adults in the room and keep everyone in order. And you may have noticed, if you didn't, that the Christian poet Dante is in two frescoes. Now, I'm something of a Dante scholar, and though not everything comes back to Dante, a lot of things do. And I'm delighted that we see Dante in two frescoes. Why? He's a poet who engages in theology, writes about the seven virtues, and in the Divine Comedy converses with Virgil about Aristotle's philosophy. That's the kind of integration we hope to see in our students, which we see here in one room and in one person at the heart of one of the church's most important churches. That's the integrated conversation the classical Christian tradition has nurtured and that we carry on and carry forward with our own students and in our schools. Now, in concluding, let me carry on with that notion of carrying forward. Because we don't just carry this conversation forward for the decades of our life on earth, but the tradition of Christian classical education teaches us that when we engage in this work, when we converse about the real, human, and holy things that endure, when we make Christian honey from the flowers of diverse fields, when we do that, we lean into the eschatological glory and taste in advance what it will be like to wonder, learn, love, and worship in the new heavens and the new earth. In the moment we enter the new heavens and the new earth, we will enter what will be both church and hospital and school all at the same time. And even though we may be made more fully human than we are right now, when we meet the truly human one face to face, we won't be less than human. And the kind of things that delight us now as humans will delight us then, because that's how God made us. In that moment, the conversation between the saints and the prophets and the conversations between the theologians and the conversations we've been having this week will become one glorious and eternal conversation. And so, Hugh of St. Victor suggests that the activity of learning proleptically anticipates the eschatological leisure of eternal life and provides what he calls a foretaste of the sweetness of the eternal quiet. Isidore of Seville, that through a life of study, Christians may live in a manner now that resembles the life of their future home. Cassiodorus, that the wisdom earned from study and labor here is an glorious and eternal attainment. Aquinas, that the contemplative life begins here in order to be made perfect in the life to come. Melanchthon refers to someday learning in the eternal academy. And Joseph Pieper describes the contemplative mode of beholding creation, of standing still and learning to be astonished as the foretaste and beginning of perfect eschatological joy. This is learning that doesn't terminate at the job site, the ballot box, or the university, but leads into eternity. It means that what is going on in schools scattered throughout the history of Christian classical education and what you do in your schools scattered across various African nations and what we do in our schools in various schools scattered across North America is no trifling thing. And the work of the classical Christian educator is no low calling. Instead, this is something the church has always done, It aligns with the mission and mandate from God. Our cultures always have and always will need it. And it seems like it may be something we find ourselves doing for all eternity. We might as well get after it. And I, for one, am looking forward to doing that with all of you. But in the meantime, friends, we've got some work to do. So again, we might as well get after it. And frankly, if Africans like Clement and Augustine and Origen and the Europeans Hugh and Herod and Melanchthon and all these other people in this long tradition could see what we're trying to do in the United States and Kenya and across Africa and across the world, they would recognize it as a common work with them, in common with their work, and they would recognize that our work is a common work. And they would ask God, I'm sure, to use it for the common good of the church and the world he calls us to love. And so, friends, with the kind of hope for the journey that Robin Burlew pointed us to yesterday, we join our efforts with their efforts and with your efforts to revive this great tradition of Christian classical education and make it available to our children and our children's children and our nation's children and the world's children so that they can do the human work God created them to do and pursue a lifetime and eventually an eternity of standing still, learning to be astonished, of loving one another, and of worshiping the glorious God, the gracious God who made us, called us to this good work, and will one day call us home with the words, "Well done, good and faithful teachers." So blessings upon your work and upon you and your students and your schools. And if on this earth we don't see you again, we'll simply look forward to taking our place alongside you in the someday coming eternal academy at the feet of Christ, our teacher. Thank you.